Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today and taking a Wednesday afternoon out of your summer to learn more and be engrossed in methods, which is so near and dear to my heart. And I think today we have a great set of speakers and discussants. So I'm super excited that you've taken the time to join us. And we have a variety of methods that we're going to be talking about. So even if you're a micro person, it's important to hear from macro people, macro hear from micro, and qualitative as well. And so as you're going through as an attendee, as you're listening to these presentations, one thing I want to encourage you to do is think about the connections between them. And we'll have time kind of throughout to ask questions, but a key thing, what are the benefits that I see when we bring three different kind of broader areas together is just to see what are the commonalities, what are the differences, where can they tie in together? Because I think we can learn a lot and have more robust research when we use multi-method approaches, or at least use approaches that have been thought about and informed by others. So it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily apply, for example, content analysis in your research, but knowing that it's there, knowing some of how it could work, some applications can help you regardless of what you're doing. So we have three great speakers today that we're going to start with some qualitative analysis with archival data. Then we're going to go through content analysis and then some optimization towards the end of the call. I'm going to be watching the Q&A as we go through, so that's an easy way to ask questions. Most of the speakers are either going to have time built in the middle or towards the end, so that if there are questions, we want to make sure that we get them answered. So please put them in the Q&A. Don't put them in the chat. I'll have the chat up as well, but much easier for me to manage through the Q&A feature that's built in here to Zoom. Without further ado, I think we'll go ahead and start with Stina. So she's from Northeastern University, super talented researcher. She's going to be talking about dynamic theorizing, qualitative analysis with archival data. So sorry for the super short introduction, but the reputation precedes you. So I'll let you go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. And I just want to kind of build on the introduction remarks and say that I think that no matter what you are doing, then at least having some kind of, whether or not you're quant research or qual researchers, having some kind of insight or working a little bit with qualitative data will really help you in your research process. Because I have work also a lot with quantitative data. And I work with a lot of students who do quantitative analysis. And I think a way to make your quantitative analysis better is just to do a little bit of qualitative data collection and understanding before you start your quantitative project, because it will really help you in knowing what your context is all about, and understanding the variables that you actually have in your data set. What do they mean in an organizational and industry context? And that becomes so important for you in order to create a really important contribution with your data. And it's also from that qualitative data that we often get good insights. Because what is qualitative data analysis really about? Qualitative analysis is about generating a new theory. It's in that sense, the goal of qualitative analysis is very different from quant analysis. When we do qual analysis, we are not trying to do causal identification. We are not trying to prove a hypothesis. What we are trying to do is generate a hypothesis. And I want you to bear that in mind as I'm talking, because it's very important that our goal is always just to try to come up with a new theory, a new thing we could hypothesize, because creating a new hypothesis is actually very difficult, right? I know that, when we talk about methods, we talk a lot about how to causally identify and prove our hypotheses. I think in the field of management, we spend a lot of time on that. We spent way less time thinking about how do I actually generate my new hypotheses in the first place. It is as though this new hypothesis should come out of the theory. However, where does this, if you're just drawing on existing theory that's there already, your hypothesis is not going to be new. So how are you going to generate a new hypothesis? And if you don't have a new hypothesis, you are not going to have an important paper, right? So the most important thing for you to do is to generate that new hypothesis. I mean, and that is true for qual and quant, right? So if you're a quant researcher, you want to generate a new hypothesis so you can go out and test it. If you're a qual researcher, you want to generate this new theory, a new theory that hopefully somebody else can stand on your shoulders and go out and test that with quantitative data. And so that the two methods in that way go hand in hand about hypothesis generation, hypothesis testing, hypothesis generation, hypothesis testing. And so, but the question then becomes, how do we actually come up with these new hypotheses? And my opinion is that qualitative research is a really, really good way to do that. And nowadays, we have traditionally done qualitative research mostly by doing observational analysis. That is, we go out in organizations or we observe people in other locations outside of organizations, for example, at industry conferences, and we observe what they are doing and we try to get insights about their behaviors. Or we go out and interview them. We have some interview questions we're interested in, and we might go out and interview them to learn something new. However, nowadays, our world is digital. And in this digital world, people, organizations, and markets leave digital traces in forms of text that we can go out and exploit in our qualitative analysis. And this is what I call dynamic. I call archival data. Archival data doesn't have to be something that's very old. Archival data is contrasted to observational analysis and observational analysis and interviewing. That this is data that was generated by individuals, by organizations, or by markets themselves that leave the digital traces. We didn't generate the data, which is very different because in observational analysis and interview data, we generated the data. We went out in the field and took field notes, or we interviewed people and asked them questions. But this archival data was not generated by us. It is a textual data source that we can collect and use. And so I want to give credit where credit is due, that many of my thoughts around this topic is generated together with Anders Dahl Krabbe and Micah Radunov. And together we have a working paper about how to do dynamic theorizing, as we call it, with archival data. This presentation will also draw on my recent AMR paper with Michelle Anthony and Audrey Holm, that together we developed ideas about how to do new data analysis. And lastly, it's also based on my SMJ paper with Steve Call about multi-level discourse analysis. So I'll draw on all of those elements. I just want to give credit where credit is due. And so, as I said, this qualitative analysis can really be found, qualitative data, archival data can be found in many locations, such as blog, social media entries, internal company documents, trade journal, press releases, newspaper articles. We can use all of this to generate insights about organizations or markets or individuals and how they function. But one of the problems with this data is that it tends to be overwhelming. And this overwhelmingness contrasts with in prior archival qualitative analysis, we tend to have nearly a scarcity of data. We only had a few interviews because we were only human and we could only go around and interview that many people. We could only be in so many places at one time to do our observational analysis. In contrast, when you work with archival data, there's a nearly infinite amount of data. It's company blogs, or if you search just for company press releases about an industry, right? You'll get thousands and thousands and thousands of articles. So how are you actually going to analyze that data qualitatively? Because we have a limited amount of time as human beings and as researchers. We cannot read through thousands and thousands of articles. We need a process through which we can take that data, use it, and make theoretical insights into that. So what should we do? Well, traditionally, it's not that people have never used archival data before. People have done it, but it tended to be just a side dish, something that you did in addition to your interviews and to your observations. But nowadays, with all this amount of data, we need to think about actually using archival data as the main meal in many of our papers, and the main source through which we actually get our insights. Because there's so many opportunities for doing a lot of work with archival data analysis. We can observe actions as they unfold, so we can begin to track the actual data, what actually happens, what do individuals do, what do organizations do. We can track that through time and create insights into how that dynamicism unfolds in real time without having retrospective data, a retrospective bias as we normally have, right? And we can also study processes over time. So we can do that, for example, longitudinal study that takes many more years, or stretches many more years than we could actually spend as researchers investigating a phenomenon, right? We can have to collect data over 100 years or more, 200 years. Or it can also be a shorter time period where we just get kind of minute micro data about what actually happens at different points in time. We can also study different spatial locations, whereas before we could only be, as researchers, we could be in very limited amount of locations. We could not study a global phenomenon. Well, if you want to, but if there are many things today that happens in a globalized world where it's not enough to just be in one place at one time. We can collect archival data on a phenomenon that, for example, happens across time. If we want to understand the Me Too movement, well, it was not only a US phenomenon, right? It was Me Too movement was a global phenomenon that had reaches across the globe. And to understand it, we can collect archival data from a lot of different spatial locations. We can also study a lot of new phenomenons, for example, field level and industry level dynamics that are very difficult to study otherwise with interview data or with observational data. And we can also study phenomenon that people might not otherwise want us to talk about. For example, we might not have access to do interviews with elite organizations or hidden organizations or secretive organizations, but sometimes they still leave a paper trail, and we can follow that textual sources and get information about these organizations that otherwise would never grant us access to study them. But what are the challenges? And so this is kind of where I mostly want to go today, because there's some challenges and where I hope I can be helpful. So I see one challenge is about what is actually the unit of analysis with archival, with in a traditional qualitative analysis. The unit of analysis has always been the quote. What did people say? So what did they say? However, with archival data, all of a sudden you get a lot of things that are not just text. It could also be numbers. It can be images. And how do you then process that, right? And there I would argue that we actually need to go beyond just the quote as the unit of analysis and look at all of these elements, be they linguistic, where the images or the numbers, and together we can add them into our qualitative analysis, because numbers also provide meaning. They're a unit of meaning that we need to incorporate, and then we need to triangulate between these different sources of data that we have. But I want to say that there are two core tensions when we talk about doing archival research. And that is that there's this abundance of data, but we have a limited amount of time as researchers. So we cannot just walk through all of it. How are we going to collect and analyze all of this archival data that's out there about our phenomenon, right? And so in traditional qualitative research, what we did was that we collected all the available data, and then we did snowball sampling to get more data. But instead, archival data has this opposite problem, and that means that we need to develop a new sampling strategy. So how do we actually sample in our archival data to make sure that we have a meaningful sample that we can begin to work on qualitatively that is manageable? And manageable, I mean, something like starting out with 300, 400 texts, right? We cannot start with 10,000 texts. We need to start out by creating a very small sample. So we need to start sampling on and creating this smaller data set we can work with, then we'll always go back and collect more data. We don't need to start by having a complete data set. And the same actually goes for quantitative data. If there are any of you out there, I think starting small is always better, because if you start small, you're not spending a lot of time up front collecting a huge data set that turns out to be non-interesting, right? You want to start small, get a sense of the data. What's out there? Is it interesting? Is there something there? If there is something there, you can go back and collect more data, right? But I see people make this mistake all the time. They end up spending like a year collecting a data set before they even start looking at it, right? So we want to start small. And then there's this other problem, is that the archival data tends to be very heterogeneous. Meaning that it's like there may be both blogs and memos and press releases and newspaper articles, and that have very different genres. And so these data are extremely heterogeneous, but we have to publish, create a parsimonious theory, right? That is simple. And so there's kind of like a tension between this heterogeneity of the data and the request to create a simple theory that can create one of these new hypotheses that I was talking about in the beginning, right? And so how do we then solve this problem of heterogeneity and simplicity on the first in the first ways? And I'd say, and so what I've developed with my co-author is a process through which we try to solve these problems, trying to say, well, it's about what we call dynamic theorizing. It's about a constant iteration between data sampling, so sampling bigger and bigger chunks of data, and theorizing that data. And so those two things happen dynamically all the time. So sampling is something that happens continuously throughout your data analysis process. And theorizing, of course, is the same. And so we can think about both sampling and theorizing throughout the research process, which in qualitative analysis, we can think about initially we generate some initial categories and ideas about what our data is about. Then we refine those categories, they become more complex. And then at the end, we stabilize what those categories are that form the basis of our theory. So we can think about first about how to sample, right? And here it is. Here I think that we can learn a lot also from quantitative analysis about that we actually need to incorporate more statistical sampling into our qualitative analysis, which is something that traditionally qualitative researchers didn't do, right? But it's not the same as in quantitative analysis, where you would just take a completely random sample of your whole sample. Here, when we're here, it becomes important that we statistically sample on the concepts that are interesting to us, right? And so this is the idea about interestingness, right? What is important? What is puzzling? What is the constructs around which we are trying to develop a theory? So we need to create samples, not of the whole data set as such. We need to create samples around constructs that are of theoretical interest to us. And then you can ask me, so how do I actually develop constructs that are of theoretical interest to me, right? How do I know that, right? Yes, right. So initially, when you start out, we begin by just creating a kind of much more statistical sample, right? And so I'll walk you quickly through this model that we develop more in the paper that we're writing. But it has these three phases, right? About both where the sampling strategy changes and the theorizing changes over time. But so when we sample, initially, and the first thing that we really want to do is that we want to create an overview of our data. So we first create an overview about what is our data like, and we create so that we kind of at least know what data do I have out there, what are my possibilities for sampling on my data, right? Because you might both have blogs and newspaper articles and industry reports, and you might have meeting logs, right? And, different things depending on what you're studying. So you first create this overview of your data. And then you begin to create a kind of a theoretical scaffolding. And this scaffold is this beginning. You need to first start at a very macro level. I mean, macro in terms of more about getting an overview of your phenomenon. You're not diving deep into the data. It's important to start at a kind of very, you need to look at the forest and not the trees, right? A macro level. So if you're dealing with an industry, you might begin to read secondary data. If you're in an organization, you might just kind of read some summary reports about what's been happening in this organization, understand what's the organizational structure. You need to create an overview of the phenomenon, or just the general trends. If you're studying the Me Too movement, for example, within an organization, you would want to know what are the key events that took place, right? Or what are the key stakeholders that participated in this? What are the what are the key ideas that people are putting forward at a very macro level? And I call it scaffold, an initial overview. And then you begin to associate each of these after you've created your scaffold, you identify some ideas you think are more interesting than others. It could be that you found it interesting that how did different departments within an organization react, for example, to the Me Too movement? Well, then you take you have maybe a lot of blogs, right, about this. People have been typing a lot, but you can't analyze all of it. So you take a statistical sample to create a smaller data set around this, right? And then when you have your maybe 300 or something like that articles, you can begin to read through it. And when you do that, you should always be trying to emphasize what is puzzling for me within this data, what is interesting. And you may begin to think, wow, it's kind of interesting that gender dynamics in these two, maybe I'm looking at kind of marketing and engineering departments, and actually turns out that gender dynamics around the Me Too movement was very different in these departments. It just seems interesting, right? That in one maybe place, men are participating a lot in the discussions, and the other department is mostly females, right? That could be something puzzling. You at this point in time, you don't know what your new theory is going to be. You don't really know why is that going to be a theoretical contribution. It's just something you stumble upon, where you have to use your intuition a lot. A qualitative data is a creative process. It's about using yourself and your imagination and what this, in a sense of mobilizing your own curiosity about why does that just seems interesting. We then begin to go into the kind of main meat of doing this archival data analysis, which is really, we begin then to identify some key constructs, right? And that could, for example, be gender. Right. So then I'm interested in gender. Then instead of looking at all the blogs, I might begin to say, okay, gender is my construct. I'm going to create a representative sample about gender. So then I create a search words that are related to gender, and I search within the larger data set to create a smaller sample again. Create a sample. Then this is all the blogs that has something to do with gender, right? But that might still be too big a data set. Well, then I might have 2,000 blog posts. It's too much for me to look at. So then I take a statistical sample within that, right? 2,000, and I maybe again get down to like 200-300. And then I can begin to work with this data and ask things like, who is writing it? Then I begin to engage in this kind of hermeneutical questioning. Who wrote this? Why did they write it? What was, how was this text generated? And I begin to look at the relationships, the intertextuality between these texts. What are they actually, how are they responding to each other? How do the men react when the women, people who identify as female, how do they actually react to this? What are the different back and forth that are going on? So these are the intertextual relationship between the texts in my data. And then I always try to aim for theoretical simplicity. What is the most simple story that I can tell out of my data? If qualitative people mostly make the mistake when they may do qualitative analysis that they write too complicated a paper. There are too many things going on. So in qualitative analysis, you should always try to aim for fewer construct, fewer things going on, right? Try to create the fewest amount of elements that you can use in order to tell your story. And there'll always be a lot of things going on in your data that you cannot explain, that you have to ignore. And so qualitative analysis is also about choosing which elements am I going to focus on, which things are important for making a new theory, not about representing the whole data. Because in any data set, there's going to be thousands of stories. I think about the qualitative data as the same way as I think about the patent data set. You think about the patent data set. We have about maybe, I don't know how many in total, what do you think, 300,000 papers written on the patent data set, right? Because people have chosen different variables, different relationship between those variables to study inside of the patent data set, right? And the same thing in qualitative analysis, you have to choose your variables, the constructs you're going to focus on. And most of them you won't use the same way as if we do quant analysis, and we don't use all of the variables inside of the patent data set, right? We choose to focus on a few of them, our dependent and our independent variables that we're going to use to tell the story. So in that sense, it's very similar. And we keep iterating through this process, that developing new constructs, sampling within each construct, trying to figure out what's interesting here and creating our theory. And so by doing this, we are iterating, and we then reach the end of kind of theory stabilization when we have reached saturation on each construct. When we feel now and maybe a construct around gender, and I feel like I'm not learning more about this gender dynamic. I'm keep sampling, I don't learn more about gender. Or I've also maybe become interested in power and how power plays into my story. And I've been sampling on power, and I feel that I'm saturated inside of this about the construct. And I then begin to, that is when my categories start to stabilize, and I begin to have an idea about what my theory is going to be. Right, so we reach saturation and we create still theoretical simplicity. And I just here in the end, I actually would love to take have time for questions over this. I went through the model very quickly. Is that one thing that I like about archival data is that it lends itself to quantification, not just quantification in terms of testing on running regression models, although you can also do that if you have that kind of inclination, but also to kind of track things systematically over time, which is something we can't really do at least with interviews, in my opinion. I know people differ in this, but in my opinion, because the interviews were generated based on our questions, right? And so we created the data, whereas archival data was actually created by the people we study, inside the organization. So they are meaningful elements to actually quantify and track and look at dynamics over time, or differences between, let's say, different departments or different companies in ways we can't do with other kinds of data. And so what do I think that the contribution is here in terms of thinking about archival data analysis? Well, I want to encourage you, I hope I've given you just a little bit of interest in, we can do a lot of things. I really think there's great opportunities to use archival data to study phenomena, to write qualitative papers, but also to learn more before we go out and we engage in our quantitative studies. In that initial phase where we're trying to figure out what's puzzling here, what's actually the interesting thing in my data, before I go ahead and I dive deep into other forms of methods and causal identifications and my different model or whatever I'm running, right? I can get insights. And this kind of data allows us to study actions in real time as they unfold, right? It allows us to study things that happen across long periods of time. I have myself papers that study phenomenon over a 100-year period, right? Something I couldn't do with any other method. Right? It allows us to be in many places at the same time. I've also exploited this in one of my projects, that we can be in many spaces and places at the same time, and we can study a new phenomenon that other types of qualitative data don't lend itself well to. For example, it's difficult to kind of study the industry by doing observational analysis, because the industry doesn't really unfold in one observation, right? We can't really get a handle on the industry, whereas, well, we can study industry reports, right? And these actually tell something about the industry, and we can track that over time. But we need to deal with this co-tension, right, between this overwhelming amount of data and our own limited capacity, the heterogeneity of this data, and our aiming for this for these parsimonious simple theories. And this is where thus we need to have this dynamic interactions between sampling. Always start small, create a very small sample, and then we're constantly sampling on constructs, and we create small little data sets. So our data set is kind of built little by little. We end up with a big data set in the end, but it wasn't built that way initially. We add to it every time we find a new thing we're interested in. We'll build a little small data set around it to investigate that interesting phenomenon that we have created. And so our data set will be built like a house over time. And that theoretically we are constantly aiming for simplicity. And so I also think it's just that this is also a way we can increase the rigor of qualitative analysis by doing this, because we are able now to triangulate with many more data sources and get a better handle on what is actually the phenomenon that we are studying. And so now I'll open up for any questions or comments that people might have.
So I'll say, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. We already have 2 that have come in, so I'll just read them out to you. That'll probably be the easiest. So the first one, thank you very much for the presentation. I see that there is a lot of back and forth between data and theory, but if you have to put a label on dynamic theorizing, wouldn't it be more of a bottom-up theorizing than top to bottom, or can it be used both ways?
I mean, I think it's really always both ways. I think also that really most of our research is both bottom up and top down, and that actually the idea that qualitative analysis is something that's an inductive. I mean, you often hear this word inductive theorizing. I think that it's mislabeled, and it actually leads people astray, because if you think about qualitative research as something that's inductive, you also have this idea that if I just kind of spend a lot of time with my data and code it a million ways, then my theory is going to kind of bubble up through that, right? It's going to be this bubbling up of a theory. And I actually think that the way we generate theories is much more like goal-based categorization. We need to have a goal. Our goal is to construct a theory. And we actually then actively pursue certain questions, and those questions comes out of theory, right? I mean, why do I think something is puzzling? Well, it's also because I know something about the world, right? Whether I'm a seasoned researcher or a junior researcher, I do have, even as a incoming PhD student, I'll have some theories about how I think about organizations that I've created because I have met organizations throughout my life, right? And so we will always, in that sense, it's always, I think, an abductive process where theory and the data need to go hand in hand iteratively in order to create, because your theory needs also to be novel, right? I mean, you don't know what's novel if you're not working also in the backdrop of the theory. But then it also needs to be, that theory needs to be challenged by the data. Well, I see it as kind of like a struggle between the existing theory and the data, where the data pushes the existing theory because you identify a phenomenon that the existing theory cannot explain.
The next, and we've got quite a few, considering the macro level focus inherent in archival data, for example, CEO letters, how do researchers effectively apply this approach to investigate micro level phenomenon or micro level topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many micro-level phenomena that can be addressed, for example, through blogs, right, where people write about their topics, for example. Let's say also, I have a research project on the hearing aid industry, and they're one of the data sources we use a blog post about how people feel about wearing a hearing aid device. So these are users, right, that have, reflect on the stigma they feel, what it was like, how they feel that impacts their relationship with their partner, for example, wearing a hearing aid. So I think that there are many kind of a micro level phenomenon, depending on the data that you collect, that can easily be addressed with archival data. However, of course, there's some limitations in terms of most archival data being public, and that does mean that there's certain things people might not discuss as much. They do sometimes in some of these anonymous forums, like, for example, the Hearing It forum that we are using. But of course, that's where the hermeneutical questioning is so important. You need to understand, why was this text created, by whom, for whom, right? And is it, if it's a public document, will people express their true opinions in it, right? And so we need to always be critical of it. And I think that archival research can do certain things that it's good at. For example, tracking things over time, studying a multiplicity of things. There are also things it's not good at. It's not as good as getting inside people's heads and really getting to their thoughts and feelings, just because some documents don't talk about that so much. And there's the interview is much better, right? The interviewing has a foresight in terms of getting people to talk about their opinions, how they understand things, how they make sense of things. And observation is very good at studying people's behavior, the practices that they have, but also very bad at understanding people's thoughts and feelings, because often when people, let's say, work, they don't talk to you, they don't express why are they doing something, they just do it. So very good at, ethnography is very good at studying behavior. And so each of those kind of 3 data sources have its strengths and weaknesses. But I think that it's not so much a micro macro question, it's more about the kind of question you have.
We just have 2 minutes, but the next question is perfectly dovetailed into that. How do we create synergy between the interview and the archival data during analysis, if we're using both? Is there any analysis difference that we should be very of to begin with? So, kind of the interplay between interviews and archival data. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think they go really well hand in hand. Again, I think it's very interesting to contrast them with each other, and see what's there. For example, I was giving a qualitative methods workshop the other day, and I had people look at ChatGPT, and they were both doing observations. First, they observed each other using ChatGPT, then they interviewed each other about it, and then we read archival material about ChatGPT. And it was so interesting for the participants to see what the different things we learned through those 2 or 3 methods, right? And we could use the interviews and the observations to contrast with the archival data, because doing the observations, everybody was like, this thing is crap, like I don't really understand how to use it, doesn't know anything, it doesn't answer my questions, it's not precise. And then in the interviews it was more like, oh, yeah, it's probably very interesting and there's many things to be used for. And then in the archival data, it was like, it's going to change the world and it's going to be either a dystopian future or utopian future, right? And we realized that there was these weird contrast between the practical experience of using it versus the discourses around the technology. And so I think contrasting, saying what the thing I'm learning in my interview, do I see that in my archival data? Let me go and look. And like, oh, maybe I'll get confirmed, right? Okay, yes, it is actually what people say. It's also what I see there. Great, right? Other times might be, no, it's actually not, right? And that doesn't mean that one of the data sources is wrong. It can just be that it actually shows an interesting organizational phenomenon, right? So I think that's where we can always triangulate. I did that in another paper also, in an old paper I wrote in 2011 on stress. And email, and where we saw that actually when we began to triangulate what people said in the interviews, that is that email was the thing causing them stress. And then what we saw in the quantitative data, which was that being in meetings caused them to be stressed out. Then that actually led to the theorizing we did in the paper, right? So, so I think it's very important to be doing both at the same time. Again, with interviewing, just do a few interviews, right? Then collect a little data set, and look at them and compare them. And, again, always start small, right? That's the golden rule. Start small, whatever method you're using.
Excellent. So we're going to transition to Jeremy's presentation. I did want to say that there are still some open questions. If you open up the Q&A, and if you have a few minutes to stay, if you wouldn't mind maybe for some that can have a short typed answer, you can just go in and type an answer to them. And then if it's okay, I would encourage those that have still questions you can potentially reach out as well and contact and ask beyond just this presentation. Because again, a big part of this is to build a community of people that are doing this kind of cool work. And so if you want to engage in this, I encourage you to engage with our presenters as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate the time. Super interesting presentation. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, it was my pleasure. And please, to everybody, please reach out with questions and I'll try to answer now the questions in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're going to transition now to Jeremy Short from the University of North Texas. Jeremy has been in the content analysis world for a long time. That's how he and I got to know each other quite well. And so his presentation titled How to Have Your Way with Words, Content Analysis Types and Tips. And so I'll let you go. And then again, Q&A, feel free to put questions in as you're listening to the slides, listening to the presenters, and we'll address them as we go along. So thank you very much.
Okay, well, I couldn't have asked for a better setup than from Sina, because really everything I do, although I would not, probably most people would not call my work qualitative, comes from that perspective and way of thinking, and thinking about the almost always archival data and my processes of coming up with research questions. And I really like the questions people had as well, because I think really I tend to do, work that's kind of more macro oriented with that kind of research design, but probably most of the things I'm thinking about in the development of independent variables or things that I would use to test hypotheses are much more micro in nature. So hopefully this kind of gets at the answer to some of those questions about integrating macro and micro. And I always read anything that ever has content analysis in JAP. I probably read that, and then I can almost immediately apply it with limited changes in terms of the sensibilities of what folks are doing. It will inspire my own work, which tends to be maybe using crowdfunding campaign, very different types of narratives. So I have way more slides than I'll ever be able to go through. And I really, after talking to Tim this morning, going back and forth through email, would like to answer more questions anyway. So I want to get you thinking about just a few pinpoints that really, again, capitalize on what Sina was doing a great job of explaining about. How are we going to get these words from being words on paper to words that we are analyzing in some kind of practical and theoretical way? So I'll stop after a couple of these bullet points, and I doubt I'll get to all four of these goals anyway. So there's two quotes I love and I always think about when I'm thinking about the research I do in content analysis in general. One is Confucius: words are the voice of the heart, the innermost thoughts of someone's being. Something, we'll write a letter, a love story, a poem, a song. And then I think about Stephen Wright saying, I was reading the dictionary, I thought it was a poem about everything. So I think when we start talking about the archival content analysis world, I always go back in a less systematic way to what Sina was saying is, well, what are we really looking at? Or we don't want to just have a sort of a garbage in, garbage out. There's all these ways to look at dictionaries, and I'm going to go over some of those in a minute, and they're interesting and they're really fun, but it's not just about how can I get this huge data set that has a bunch of words, and how can I get some whatever older or newer content analysis or dictionary based or topic modeling or whatever it is, elaborate ChatGPT, how can I just put those things together and magically a paper is going to occur? Because I think that's where probably the creative process and the research process tends to break down quickly when I talk to folks about coming up with ideas. So we're going to try to navigate those things together, but what we want to start with was that kind of qualitative sensibility. What is in these documents we're looking at? What are they talking about? What are they interested in? So for me nowadays, a lot of the research I would do would be in crowdfunding. So I'm thinking about crowdfunding documents. So on some level, they're kind of like marketing. You're trying to get someone to fund your campaign, but maybe it's a social campaign. So maybe you are talking about something about your identity, something about yourself, something you want people to know. Maybe you're talking about positive words or negative words. What is the tone? Is it like Shark Tank where people are going to beat up on ideas, or does it need to be very positive? So all of these are things that are kind of going on in my head, and very similar to Stina's idea, like before I would ever think about any kind of paper, I would look at whatever documents I'm going to hope to analyze and look at a bunch of, like, are they really talking about this thing I want to study? What does it seem like they're talking about? Can this inform my research question? They sure do mention, maybe it's politics. Like, man, I'm kind of surprised these documents mention politics a lot. I wouldn't have guessed about that. Maybe I can do a study looking at political rhetoric or political language. So I'm always thinking in this sensibility about words. And I love this old quote by Jeff Pfeffer. In the field of organizational behavior, there's frequently very little that is either organizational or behavioral. And so much of our research is, myself, I'd say I come much more from the strategy tradition. When I was coming up in a doctoral program, is like a lot of archival data of CompuStat. And so it's just an R&D spending number. So how can we get to more cognitive things from that? And then when you look at the OB world, like, okay, you're really getting in some cognitive ideas with psychometric type, survey measures, but then we're putting a lot of faith in, well, that person bubbled in like a 5 or a 7. I should think deeply about that. So I would say the work I do when I think about content analysis is kind of a quasi-qualitative. I'm thinking in that way and looking at these documents, but then I'm gonna try to turn it into numbers pretty quickly as best as I can. But what's important is there's something about these naturally occurring documents that's interesting to me and to other people. And they are some kind of behavior. We don't always know if it's their true cognitions, if it's our identity, if it's just a selling document, if it's impression management, but it's something created by other people of some organizational importance. Back, there was this headline several years ago was a comment Trump made was seen as a declaration of war to Korea, but we know that these actual documents mean something to somebody, and we always analyze them. So that's what I'm trying to get at today a little bit in a few minutes. This is recent guidelines for APA inclusive language. These guidelines are changing. People are thinking about words differently. How do you project them? So how can we turn that into interesting, meaningful organizational research questions? So somebody else I saw had a comment on one of the questions. I'm happy to give all these slides to Tim or Hoda, whoever I would need to turn these over to. But I would point you to a couple of articles, one older and one a couple of years ago, that kind of might give you some ideas of, or compile some of the thoughts I've had, or and others. This was actually in an OB journal, and it was looking at some of the different ways people have used computer-aided text analysis. And the spoiler alert for this is really simple. All I'm gonna try to do is count numbers, simple counting of numbers. And the sensibility in a lot of research in this area is that if someone talks about something more, that means something. And there's been a whole lot of research that's looked at this, where you would come up with some kind of construct and then look for that. So I'll stop now and see if there's any general content analysis questions before I talk too much, or I can go back and answer the ones I really like further.
I think you can take that either way you want.
What I would say in the previous questions is that I would very much think of the work I do, bridges, macro, micro, bits of qualitative, but is informed by both. There's many ways to do content analysis, but I tend to think of it as if I'm developing a construct.
So I don't see any questions that have been added since Stina's presentation. So I would say keep going, and people add, and then at the next pause, even if you have something that you wanted to ask now, just add it, and Jeremy will get to it at the next pause. Is that okay? Perfect.
So can you share my screen, if I blocked it with the question thing? Is that just I'm looking at on my end?
We can see it.
Okay. Move something over here. So I think the first question that tends to come to a lot of people is, what kind of documents can I use in my research? And the confusing but easy answer is sort of anything that you think makes sense, that you're able to glean some sort of insight from. But as Stina mentioned, generally when we're thinking about this from an archival perspective, it's some naturally occurring document that has value. A question I get from a lot of people is, well, could you content analyze interviews? Sure, you could, but the nature of how, at least the work that I've tended to do is, but the point is they were created by someone else naturally and then might tie to some other natural phenomenon. So content analysis, and there's many books on this, is just coming with some kind of knowledge of the content of these, any kind of narrative. And it's been done from a very qualitative tradition. You would read an entire document and glean insights. And it's been executed in a very mathematical tradition, where you would, what they sometimes call bag of words. You would find words that you think are meaningful and count them. So I am probably a bit more in that camp, but trying to make it look more like some kind of psychometric construct as best as I can. So I'll talk about the older article I had, because it was I think the first article I got published in a decent journal, and it was something that was my second year paper when I was a doctoral student at Louisiana State. And at the time, there had been a lot of research looking at performance comparators, performance reference, how CEOs might compare their performance to other companies. And I started studying about that, like that CEO cognition stuff is really interesting. And then I was learning about other ways you could study, like, well, what if I sent out a survey to all the Fortune 500 CEOs? And I quickly realized that I would never get any back. So I started looking for techniques. How could I get at this idea of looking at elements of cognition, knowing that there's certain data that might be really great data, but I'm never going to have access to it. I couldn't do the qualitative thing. Probably was not going to interview a lot of CEOs. Probably they were not going to answer my survey measures. So I saw that there was a tradition of looking at versions of content analysis where you would look at CEO letters. And that was the first paper that really looked at that. So there was a previous Feigenbaum, Hart, and Schindel article that looked at performance comparators, a theoretical article. And I thought, okay, I can look and see if they compare to the markets in their shareholder letters or to themselves, if they mention ROA, if they're looking internally, if they're looking externally. So that's how I got going on content analysis, and that was all manual. I read the shareholder letters. I would mark when they would mention a performance measure, and then I would look to see if they compared it to the past or future or to competitors or their own internally. So that would be an example of manual content analysis. And this is before we had as many really good elaborate techniques to look at things very quickly. So I started with a theoretical framework that looked at types of performance competitors. I think it was just sort of internal, external, and past and future, something like that. And so in that sense, it's kind of deductive in its deductive in its thinking. Now, what I've done more recently is a lot of stuff that counts very quickly using elaborate techniques. Now we can look at a huge data set of thousands and thousands of crowdfunding campaigns or shareholder letters or many other ideas. As I mentioned, this is often called the bag of words approach, because what you were doing is coming up with words that you hope are meaningful, and then saying if people project those words a lot, does that impact, say, their crowdfunding performance or success or whatever you were looking at. And there is a pretty large tradition of this way of using content analysis. It's not the right way, it's one way. There's many ways, and I would say as a content analysis quasi-qualitative fan, I kind of love them all. It's just once I learned one, it seemed to track pretty well, and so I just kept doing more and more of that, and it kept being fairly interesting. So basically, credit to Aaron McKinney for making the slide years ago. You take a bunch of narratives and it's going to turn it into numbers. And you're going to tell it, I want to look at organizational ambidexterity. And these are the words that I think reflect organizational ambidexterity. And usually, hopefully, I'll make a big point that I'm always thinking of is because I want a lot of statistical variance, I generally want a construct that has a bunch of dimensions. If I can do it. That's, again, not the right way, but that is one way, and it tends to be what I think of. So if we have time, I can go through an example of another older paper that looked at entrepreneurial orientation, and that has 5 dimensions. And so you'll pick one dimension, innovativeness, and then you're looking at a bunch of words. So what I noticed back in the day when I started doing more content analysis is that in the way that my colleagues in OB had spent many years refining, say, a measure of burnout or some other kind of multidimensional scale. For content analysis, people would look at, an SMJ and AMJ and articles in the 90s and those time periods, or even early 2000s, like, yeah, we just looked at words for innovative, and people just kind of just took that for granted. There wasn't a whole lot of walking through it in a detailed way. So really, most of the research I've done is the thinking in my head. How can I kind of copy the way of thinking an OB person would use, developing scales elaborately, and apply that to precision in using words for some kind of construct, and then take that into whatever substantive area that I'm looking at that I find interesting. So again, hopefully I've made it clear that I'm mostly just counting words. Almost my entire career is based on counting words. I would say Algebra 1, but I think it's simpler than that. Counting words in an elaborate way. And that's what a lot of the content analysis research in many ways tends to look at it. And because I'm counting words, the words should be things that are seen as provocative or interesting. In my case, I'm pretty much always using some naturally occurring document. So then it'll be, why did they say that useful or interesting or strange word? And it's data that's archival, because that's how I can get huge data sets, knowing the challenges that I had of talking to people in a qualitative tradition, or getting a large sample of organizational type data, which is challenging, or was challenging for me at the time. And some of these things would still be challenging. So I would agree with what Sina said, if you caught it, that we tend to think of inductive and deductive, and that can be confusing or maybe wrong-headed, or maybe kind of put you on the wrong track, because I would say when I look at any kind of content analysis study, it's very iterative. The first thing I'll do is think, okay, let's go look at a bunch of documents and just see what they seem to be talking about. So, and then usually maybe I have an idea, maybe I have a framework I want to test, which would, in my case, largely a lot of times I'm thinking about a construct. I know there's this construct studied more in OB, positive psychological capital. I know the dimensions of it are hope, optimism, confidence, and resilience. Let's see if they use those kind of words in crowdfunding documents. And then there is an inductive element too. We're like, oh, okay, they didn't do that at all, but they did this instead. So maybe my theory changes, or my way of thinking changes, or words I had in my head are not the words people actually use in this context. So this tends to be what people a lot of times will talk about when they're saying topic modeling. Let's look at and it's more complex than this, but let's see what the data is telling us, what is projected a lot, and then we refine it from that way. Where deductive way is, let's come up with our bag of words or constructs and move from it that way. But you tend to always do a little bit of both. So what we had in the article, and I also wanted to kind of mention in this context, is there's many good, interesting software packages that already have a lot of these words put into them, that usually come from sometimes fairly different traditions. Diction is one that comes from a political science tradition. So it's great if you're looking at political science ideas, but then maybe the way they would use a word like optimism would not be what we tend to think of from more of a management OB perspective. Luke has a lot of words that are from more psychology perspective. We developed our own CAT scanner because other programs used to crash more, and it helped remove some other problems. So you can look at what we've done. Atlas and Vivo, those tend to be used more for qualitative analysis, where you must find the words in context. And I would say in most papers where we use these, we kind of use all of them, although we might use one as sort of the main one in any paper just to check our reliabilities, make sure our word counts are the same. I don't think I've ever had a paper where one particular word was not nitpicked. So then you have to look in Vivo and find the words in context and say, like, okay, maybe that word was really weird. We were looking at a study we were working on the other day, and it had the word lead in it, talking about elements of leadership, whatever. But that's also what LED would be, like for a LED light. So you have to go and like, oh, okay, that's not what we meant to try to pick up on. So you're always kind of using all these techniques, and I will fast forward through these slides, but I would say they are pretty infinite. There's a lot of papers that have been written on those. The next thing I would want to focus on is probably the article I had several years back that kind of gives my way of thinking, a lot of how can you create valid constructs in an OB type thinking way when that has not been the tradition in the past. So when we had this article, we were looking at content analysis in general, as well as entrepreneur orientation. Had been studied kind of quite a bit. And what we found is that hardly any kind of validity was done in studies at that time in terms of content analysis. People just present their words, and then they would try to tie it in the strategy tradition. They tie it to form performance through CompuStat. And then we realized there's got to be a way to come up with more precision of looking at these different word lists. So a lot of the papers I've had have kind of been just sort of validating some sort of construct. And then if it's a methods paper, that's mostly what you do. And then if it's a substantive paper, like an entrepreneurship, you're tying it to whatever performance they have. That's why I think that, to me, this general research design very much blends micro and macro perspectives. When I'm thinking about constructs, I'm thinking in my head sort of what I would think of a more OB person that tends to have very advanced psychometric scale measures. Although these are not psychometric measures like that, they're counts, they're simple counts. But then I'm looking at documents that are probably getting more at a research design where you might compare organizations. That level of analysis, or crowdfunding campaigns, is similar in thinking. So what we did in this article is walk through the process, which I can say is very much like the process of coming up with the paper. So step one is, okay, what document are we going to use? And are they really talking about the thing we want to talk about? And that's where the qualitative part must formally or informally be at the forefront of what you do. I'll tell students or myself around papers, like, let's look at a bunch of these documents and see if they're really talking about this thing we think might be interesting. And sometimes you find out, like, yeah, that's kind of a dead end, or these documents are probably too short, or they're too long, or they're too convoluted with something else, or it just doesn't make sense. So a lot of time is spent saying, what does it mean if someone tweets out this or that? Can we really get something? What are we going to tie that to? What's our research design? Does it tie to something else meaningful or interesting? Because maybe I can't actually come up with any kind of theory or hypothesis test that would be logical to do it. The great thing about a lot of the research and strategy that's used shareholder letters is shareholder letters are written every year, and they tie to a CompuStat data set that's validated every year. It's a very close link, and the shareholder letter is about the company's performance. So in that sense, it's just very, very lockstep and makes sense to be aligned. You have this archival measure, and you have whatever you're looking at for content analysis. And to me, this sense of this research design is kind of like the sensibility of avoiding common method variance when you're looking at surveys. You don't want your survey and your the independent dependent variable from the same survey instrument. This model gets at that sensibility. So I'm always trying to think of that in research design. So in this case, this article did use shareholder letters and CompuStat data. And as I mentioned, we looked at a previous article that had looked at content analysis by Rhonda Rieger, Mike Farr, and Dre, and they found that back then, 2007, hardly any kind of validity was used in content analysis. And in the area of entrepreneur orientation, we looked at it like even less, like almost no types of validity you would think about. So what our article did is kind of walk through what is a similar sense or sensibility to how you might apply scale measures to content analysis. And so I'm not going to speed through all these. I want to take time for questions, but that's what that article kind of will walk through. So maybe this is a good time to stop and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, so two have come in so far. So you kind of touched on this, but maybe you could go into a little more detail about how do we know if we've fully captured a concept and associated keywords with a bag of words approach?
Sure. So there's two things we do, and we outline this article, but I won't try to find the slide. So first we come up with, for me, hopefully it's some kind of multi-dimensional construct. In the case of EO, there's already 5 dimensions. Other work we've done in narcissism and psychological capital, there's already multiple dimensions. Then you start coming up with every permutation of a word that you can think of. There used to be a book I saw that was obscurely cited in like a law review called the Synonym Finder. So we would start with that book. It's really interesting for coming up with interesting language. And some of the topics, yeah, I think you can get it for like $1 now. Yeah. And it's it'll have very interesting like turn of the century phrases, but we'll come up with every possible word that you could come up with. Then at some point, we're going to do something inductive too. We're going to say, okay, we're looking at shareholder letters. Show me every word in every document. And this takes less time than you might think. And they're like, oh yeah, that was an obvious one. When we did this paper, we looked at all these different dimensions of entrepreneurial orientation, and none of them projected the word entrepreneur, which should obviously kind of also be part of that. So you were going to look at an inductive list as well and say, okay, is this a global word for the construct? Does it fit into one of those? So I think that's how you know that you're sure. And then you, in reality, generate a lot more words than you're actually going to count, because not all words that you generate will actually appear in all documents. So I think when you go through that process, which is pretty iterative, you will capture all the words, and then you'll submit it. And if you get a revision, some reviewer will always not like one word, and they'll come up with what if you mean judge, and you're not talking about judgment, you're talking about Judge Judy. And they're like, okay, we looked, and they were never talking about Judge Judy in shareholder letter. So that will also be an iterative process.
Another question that came in, when considering computer-aided text analysis for a new construct, is it important for the construct to be multidimensional or unidimensional, or just to understand dimensionality in general?
So again, there's not a right or wrong. My way of thinking on this is that given just the nature of how statistics work, you would like to have a lot of variance on the independent variable and dependent variable. So if you have a multidimensional construct that you could sum or average, depending on how the theory has been treated before, that is gonna set you up to be more likely to capture variance on both the independent and dependent variable. So folks have done, I mean, the example I use with ambidexterity that others developed that really just had 2 dimensions. I would not want to do less than 2 dimensions. It would not be wrong. I think it might just be risk, and I'm sure people have done it, just riskier from a basic math perspective.
And then last, Peter was asking, how would you structure a research question for computer-aided text analysis?
I am not complete. I will riff on how if I understand that question. I think I would say pretty much like you would any other relationship among variables hypotheses, if I understand the question correctly. Yeah. So it wouldn't be different. Pretend like it's a scale or something else.
All right. Or that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah. How you'd see it done in SMJ, it'd be like that.
Excellent. Yeah, so we got 10 minutes left. So if you want to keep going, I'll keep the Q&A open, and
I'll keep that open. I have more fun slides I can go through.
Okay.
So what we'll talk, what the article also walks through is other things you would do. So one of the the question you had that was asked about how do you know when you're done with your word list. What we would also recommend, and everyone does now, is you're going to get multiple people to look at the words and validate, do we think this word belongs to this dimension? And this formula looks maybe more complicated it is, but you're just basically looking at agreement. Do we agree on this words? So in the sense that you would look at scale validity, there is a version of that that's been developed by content analysis folks years ago, looking at content validity. And it's really just word rater agreement. And I can tell you in different articles, sometimes they wanted us to go find like the famous person that came up with the construct. And that's what we did for a journal. Sometimes they said, don't do that. You can't have it, or everyone has to find this expert to validate their work. So we've done it multiple different ways, but there's always some element of validation where you would tell someone, here's what this construct's supposed to represent. Here's how we would see it manifest in words. Do you agree this word would manifest this dimension of this construct? And we use 2 or 3 raters depending on what we're looking at or the whim of the reviewers of that particular journal at that time. So then we come up with these really long lists, of which, again, many of the words might not ever really be used in that way. But then you're going to look at all the words that you did not, that are inductive. A lot of different programs will just give you a list of all the words that are commonly used. Diction used to call that an insistence score because you said it a little bit repetitively. And then you're going to feel pretty good about your lists for a while. Dimensionality, the other thing I think is always interesting about this kind of content analysis is if there have been previous scales, you can just kind of look at your correlations and say, this has had some elements of similar dimensionality to other scales or not. It gives you something to compare and contrast and talk about in the discussion at times. And then generally speaking, all of these are tied to some, or we want them to tie to a dependent variable. So always the major question is, in the research design from step 1 is, what words are you going to look at? And can you show me that it's very locked to the dependent variables you're looking at? So with crowdfunding, you have a crowdfunding narrative that's created in time 1. It's either funded or not in time 2, and it's funded at a certain amount. I already mentioned kind of CEO letters and CompuStat, but that is the basic research model that I have always used. There's many other ways to use content analysis, but that's how I tend to think about it, tying it to some kind of dependent variable. So I'll walk through maybe in 1 minute how I would tend to come up with an idea. I mentioned I like to steal as many things as I can from OB folks, and that is, I'll walk you through one specific example of that. So in entrepreneurship, many of you are probably familiar with crowdfunding. Donors Choose is an example, Kiva, Kickstarter, on and on. So you're asking for money from the crowd through your narratives. The narrative matters for that case. And examples are things that might not be easily funded or expensive. This Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls is a series I really like. You might have pretty complicated artistic work in there that they might not find a publisher, but by reaching out to crowdfunding, they can get that funded. The Yoga Mat for Bigger Guys, that's a good example. Dallas Jenkins' The Chosen, where he wanted to come up with the idea of having people binge watch the stories of Jesus, one of the biggest crowdfunding campaigns. Cards Against Humanity, another example of a really popular crowdfunding campaign. So we were trying to apply that sensibility to our research using some kinds of scale ideas that have existed in the past. So in this article, we looked at the idea of positive psychological capital, something had been developed in OB, had these ideas of hope, optimism, confidence, and resilience. We thought we could make those into words, and that's what that study did. Then I read a really interesting article in JAP where they looked at different tenure letters, and they found out that their recommendation letters for faculty positions. And what they found out was that when someone was writing a letter for a male job candidate, they would tend to really look at agentic outcome-oriented things in their recommendation letter. But when they were looking for a female applicant, they would tip for tenure positions, they tended to stress more nurturing type characteristics, which is problematic because of how the job is based on the more outcome-based things. So this used role theory, and I thought, well, this is exactly what we can look at in crowdfunding. We can think of how someone projects their different roles, and what those might be, and the language they use. And then the construct we use in this, we looked at narcissism. So narcissism been studied a lot in strategy, but there was room for refinement of the kind of words. So I think this would be where do my ideas come from? Like, okay, I see what they're doing here with role theory and how that's different. I see how I can apply that to the entrepreneurship world. And that's walking me through a complete idea that's very different than an OB idea. But in my head, I'm basically exactly taking that recipe. And I guess I'll end for there was actually a really interesting JP recently that looked at recipes and used content analysis and used the ambidexterity words I mentioned as part of one of the studies. And what they mentioned is if you had a breakaway recipe book, you are unlikely to want to write another one, I think. And the idea is it might be a challenge to your identity to have another breakaway recipe book. So they had a really interesting sample. When I can find interesting samples, I'm always thinking about that as well. And they use the creativity words in that case. You can kind of see how people across different areas, strategy, OB, and entrepreneurship will use content analysis in creative ways. So I would also highly recommend this if you can ever go to the content analysis workshop at AOM. It's also where I get many great ideas from other folks. So I will stop with that if we have any other questions.
So I actually have a question, just kind of to contextualize some of this. If people are just getting started out in content analysis and they're thinking about using an existing dictionary, something from a paper that they've read, what do they need to think about before they start to apply that? Like what's the thought process so they don't use it incorrectly, or what are the limitations? What should they, if they haven't done this before, what do they need to think about?
So I think the first question that's always tough for anybody and myself as well with trying to get something for a journal is, what is the level of novelty? So if we're developing a word lists and applying it in some context, well, then you're already having some element of methods novelty. If you're using a determined list, you're already taking a hit in terms of novelty. So I think that's the first question. Like, do I have enough? If I'm just doing something in a different context, is that novel enough? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. So then the next thing I would mention is, what theory is going to project something interesting about this? With role theory, there is a projection that because of stereotypes and other things, people are going to react differently to different groups. So you have a theory that makes these words more interesting versus the other study we had was generally speaking, direct effect studies are kind of less interesting. So if you're taking something unique about the theory, and using an existing list still novel? And of course, people have done that with great success, but that's just the hurdles, I think, at day one.
Gotcha. Well, right now it's quiet on the Q&A. So what I'll say is let's transition to Chelsea. And then Jeremy, if you wouldn't mind sticking around for just a few minutes in case somebody's thought of a question, they can put it in the Q&A and you'll be able to see it and answer, kind of like Stina was able to do. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to Chelsea Song from Purdue Indiana University, talking about multi-objective optimization applications in organizational science. So I'll let you take it away. And if you have questions, like I said, for Jeremy, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. And thanks again, Jeremy. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Stina and Jeremy. I learned a lot in this talk, and I am a quantitative psychologist who focuses on micro aspects, but I always love to learn from various different perspectives. And I really appreciate Karma and Research Methods Division hosting this event every year, doctoral consortium. And many years ago, I myself benefit a lot from it. And research methods is one of the things that I love to talk about. So really a big pleasure to be here. So yeah, my name is Chelsea Song. My affiliation is to Purdue/Indiana University is because I'm currently in the transition phase. I am currently assistant professor in industrial organizational psychology at Purdue University, but next month, July 1st, I will start as an assistant professor in OBHR at Indiana University at the Kelley School of Business. So that's my background. Okay, so today we will be talking about multi-objective optimization. And a lot of you might be wondering, it's a mouthful, right? It's optimization, it's a multi-objective, what is this, right? So it's in fact a quite quantitative method, but don't worry, I will show you at the end very easy to use tools to apply this. But it's a statistical method that's being used a lot and economics and engineering for decades and decades. And in fact, it's considered a data science or computer science, machine learning kind of method. But it's very, very important, very, very relevant to organizations because it helps us make decisions that optimize on multiple different goals. And I will go into a little bit detail here, but the end, my goal after this 40 minutes or 30 minutes or so is for you to understand that one, yes, we do need this kind of approach, this kind of thinking that we need to consider multiple objectives simultaneously, not just one objective. And two, I think I can do this. I think I can apply this in my own research. If these two goals were met, then I think I'm gonna pat myself in the back and think that I've done a good job. Okay, so multi-objective optimization. Try to answer this one question, which I'm sure a lot of you have thought of every single day. How do you optimize for multiple objectives simultaneously? Let me use an example. And by the way, again, this talk might seem a little bit more introductory, simply because this methodology is relatively new in the organizational science field. It was actually introduced in 2007 in a JP article, although it has been around for a long time in engineering. But more recently, there has been a lot of developments and a lot of top-tier journal articles using this methodology, and also in doctoral seminars they'll be introducing. So it does seem a little bit more introductory, but I'll quickly ramp up. Okay. How do you optimize for multiple objectives simultaneously? Let's think about a daily decision we make. When you consider where to rent or where to buy, I think many of you might be thinking about that during the summer, maybe change a location, etc. But when you make this decision, which apartment, which house to decide, you don't just think about one thing. You don't think about, oh, location, period, right? You think about, oh, is this house like, is there a character in it? Is there a neighborhood good, etc., etc. Is it new? Is it old? Is it low maintenance, etc. There's so many different objectives. The neighborhood, the location, all these are different objectives we want to optimize. We want them all, basically. So how do we make a decision that could optimize all these objectives? They won't always line up together. We want to optimize them. This is the kind of decision we make every day in our personal life. And it's also the kind of decision that organizations make every day, multiple times. So how do we optimize multiple objectives and do it effectively? That is the goal of multi-objective optimization. It's a statistical approach, but again, it's very relevant statistical approach that's actually very accessible. Okay, let's think about a couple of different topics that we are familiar with in organizational science. So for example, we might consider productivity versus cost. Right? Many organizations want to boost their productivity while lowering their cost. Right? So these are two objectives. Another one is work versus life balance. Right? If they all line up really well, we wouldn't have a lot of either in more popular media or actual academic research to talk about this balance, right? It's simply because it's hard to balance, and those we spend a lot of time thinking about it. And at more personnel front, we want to have the employees to have higher performance, but make sure they don't burn out. They also have sustainable occupational health. At the same time, we want to have the top performers to stay. Right. So these are all different objectives we want to achieve, but a lot of times these happen in a versus kind of scenario: productivity versus cost, work versus life, performance versus occupational health, performance versus retention. In other words, a lot of the times we are only limited to thinking of them as one or the other, but in reality, we want one and the other. Right. We want to have high productivity and low cost. We want to have both work and life, good performance and sustainable, not burnout, have good well-being, etc. High performer, and they stay, right? So then the question is, how do we optimize them? How do we get both of them in all of our organization applications? That is the focus of multi-objective optimization. So at this point, I hope that you can know that, okay, what we've done so far of only thinking about, say, productivity or cost is limited. In reality, we make a lot of decisions that where we want to optimize one and the other and the other. So multi-objective optimization is very relevant, and it is time for us to think of these decisions as like multiple objectives, optimizing them simultaneously. Okay, so this method, by the way, short, sometimes people will call it MOO, M-O-O, just, so multi-objective optimization is very relevant, but specifically, what does it do? Here is another example, our daily example. Here, we are talking about transportation methods. For example, if you commute to office, or maybe in the summer, you might go home to visit family members or go visit a vacation spot. How do you go to some place? You actually have multiple options. One, you can run to work, you can run to your office, right? So it's super cheap. It might be even free, but it takes a lot of time. You can even bike, and you could drive. Each of these options varies in two objectives, time and cost. Some of them are fast, but some of them are expensive, etc. So which one do you choose, considering these two objectives that you care about, time and cost? So multi-objective optimization creates these series of solutions like run, bike, and drive that give you the maximum amount of one objective. Say you give the maximum amount of time, so the fastest time at a given level of cost. For example, you just want a medium cost solution. Among these, which one gives you the fastest outcome? So specifically, multi-objective optimization provides different predictor weights to weigh different predictors simultaneously. This is actually quite similar to our very, very familiar regression weighting, where we provide different weights, beta 1, beta 2, etc., to predictor A, predictor B, variable A, variable B, to try to optimize or try to model one dependent variable, y1. So that's what regression weighting is doing. Similar to that, multi-objective optimization and also known as Pareto optimization, Pareto weighting, also provides different predictor weights and variables, beta 1, beta 2. It's the same story on the right-hand side, except the difference is that on the left-hand side, instead of only considering one objective, y1, like what regression is doing, Pareto optimization or multi-objective optimization is trying to optimize multiple objectives, y1, y2, or sometimes y1, y2, y3, y4, etc. That's the difference, right? So it's a predictor weighting method, just considering multiple objectives simultaneously. Okay, so this is the method behind. So this, how can we apply it in organizational science? So far, the main application and the more direct application has been in the hiring space. And I will talk about hiring space and how it's being used in the past almost 2 decades, almost 2 decades in organizational application and selection phase. But I'll also talk about more newer, more recent developments and try to apply it to other scenarios. Okay, so first, hiring practice. Why is this concept so important? It's so important in hiring practice because if you think about it, in hiring, we collect different information. We collect information from, say, interviews, say, personality assessments, say, ability tests, knowledge tests, etc., etc., resume. And we try to use all these information, all these predictor information to come up with one decision, higher or not higher, admit or not admit. Essentially, we are trying to combine all these information together to make one decision. The question is, how are we going to combine all this information? How do we weigh these different predictor information? And what is our goal in that decision? Oftentimes, the goal is we want to hire people who are high performers or stay long, who will also contribute to the diversity of the organization, et cetera, et cetera. We have a lot of objectives and wish and hope in our performance and our personal selection design, but we can only make one decision. So the question is, how can we make this decision while optimizing multiple goals? In the hiring scenario setting, there has been multiple papers over the years that looked at optimizing the job performance outcome as well as diversity outcome. The idea is that we want to hire high performers. At the same time, we also want to increase the organizational diversity, which is more and more important in the organizations and the societal level as well. So Pareto optimization or multi-objective optimization has been used to create this curve. And on this curve, we have dots. And these dots are basically predictor rating solutions that optimizes both performance and diversity to different extent. So organizations will choose one of these solutions, different predictor rates, use that to combine their predictor information, interview information, personality assessment, etc., to make a decision, higher or not higher, to eventually get there, hire for their dream team. Okay, so far, is there any questions? I actually cannot see. Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah, right now, nothing has come in, but yeah, keep rocking and
Okay.
rolling. Yeah.
I'll keep going. All right, so how do we generate these predictor rates? The information we need are here. For example, we might have different variables or different predictors. Say we might use resume data, ability data, conscientiousness, personality, assessment information, structured interview, integrity test, scores. What we will do is we will collect information such as predictor intercorrelation, the correlation between each predictor and the criteria, say performance, outcome, etc. And using this information, we will run some statistical model and obtain these predictor rates. And now notice that if we run a statistical regression model, we only obtain one set of predictors, and that's it. But in Pareto optimization or multi-objective optimization, we have all these different dots. Each of them is a set of predictor rates. What do I mean by that is, for example, here we have different predictors. So for example, this dot here, okay, you cannot see my
Yeah,
mouse,
we can see it.
but okay. This dot here corresponds to these rates where so for example, structured interview is rated about 0.35, cognitive test is rated about 0.3, conscientiousness is rated about 0.2, etc., etc. And this solution here corresponds to somewhere here, these predictor rates. So again, each dot on the left, the black dot, corresponds to a set of predictor rates. And what do they do is that, say this set of predictor rates will result in this much diversity and this much performance, and the newly hired applicant, new hires. Okay, so that's what multi-objective optimization does.
Chelsea,
When
can
we
I ask?
say-
Can I ask a question?
Yes, yes.
So
go ahead, please.
if we were to interpret the solution here on the right, if you're out near 21, we would say that conscientiousness has like a strong beta weight almost, as opposed to the other predictors.
Exactly.
But as we go towards a solution near 1, which is higher performance, lower diversity, then it becomes less important. Is that a fair characterization? Okay,
Exactly.
cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's a really great point. Thanks, Tim. It's actually one of the findings in one of our recent papers about if we consider both diversity and performance, or if we consider other objectives, how do all these predictors play out? If we value this objective more than the other, what does it mean? Which predictor matters more than the other if we value one over the other? So conscientious personality tests are more valuable if we want to hire for a new group of employees with more increased diversity. That is indeed one of our findings.
And then something like integrity test, which has a consistent but 0.2, so it seems like a meaningful effect. How do you interpret that in the context of the curve on the left hand side?
Yeah, that's a good point. So you'll see that it's quite consistent. 0.2. There's 5 predictors. It's consistently 0.2. It's pretty good, but it doesn't really contribute to the curve, the shifting of the curve.
Gotcha.
So it means that the weighting of integrity test is quite important too, but it doesn't it doesn't influence the result of shifting one side to the other. If you really considering, okay, I want to increase my diversity in the organization, then you might think more about conscientiousness, rating them more, but it doesn't mean that you would disregard integrity, because it's still rated quite a bit. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. All right. So what do we mean by, so these solutions, we call them, they are Pareto optimal, right? And this is a technical term that's invented by engineers. But what do we mean by Pareto optimal? Well, it means that on any point on the curve, right, all these solutions on the curve are Pareto optimal. It means that these solutions are more optimal than any point under the curve. So for example, here, the red star is what we call unit weighting, where we basically do not give differential weights to the predictors. We take the average, which a lot of organizations actually do, take the average of the, say, resume results, resume scores, interview scores, etc., and make a decision. So we'll see that unit weighting is suboptimal, because for unit weighting, we can find a solution on the curve that provides us with more diversity outcome at the same level of performance as the unit weight. We can also find another solution on the curve that gives us more performance outcome at the same level of diversity. Basically saying that simply keeping those selection practices, you keep doing your interview, you keep using your personality assessment, etc. Simply changing from your practice of averaging everything to differential rating to multi-objective optimization rating, you can gain more in the hiring outcome. So that's what it means by Pareto optimal. Okay, so the fact that this curve, you'll see that it has a negative slope, it's sloping down, means that there is a trade-off. The more steep the curve is, the bigger the trade-off, meaning that in order to increase one objective, you need to sacrifice another objective by a lot. But if the curve is quite flat, then it means that the trade-off is minimal or doesn't exist, because at different levels of one objective, the other objective doesn't change. So this curve, Tim helped us understand that this curve helped us understand how predictors perform, how the roles of predictors, but this curve also helped us understand the relation between the objectives, steep and flat. Right. All right, so a little bit more, in practice, we can select predictor rates like here. For example, this solution gives you the maximum amount of performance, but does not provide you a lot of diversity outcome. This solution provides you a lot of diversity outcome, but not much of job performance. This really depends on the value of the organization. Do you value this more than the other? Then it could help you kind of align your strategy with what your organization's orientation is. Whereas this one, number B, kind of is a solution that's in the middle. Okay, So Pareto optimization or multi-objective optimization could help us, a hiring scenario could help us optimize multiple hiring objectives. 1, 2, understand the relationship between different hiring objectives, say the steep or flat, etc., and improve predictor choices. For example, we can understand that the conscientiousness actually matters a lot in terms of the shift in the outcome, whereas say integrity is still important, but it doesn't really influence a lot in terms of the shift in the outcome. So these are the things that we could consider. All right, so that is in the hiring scenario. I think there is a question.
Yeah. Based on your experience, how do we optimize cases where they could be a negative, and then in paren they put positive, correlation between factors based on theory, diversity and discrimination, work and family conflict? So it's about optimizing cases.
Optimizing, so when you say case, okay, so I'll answer in general. The objectives when they are negatively correlated versus positive correlated, etc. So when you treat them in a statistical sense, you don't treat them differently, whether the objectives are negatively or positively correlated. You obtain the correlation matrix, the informations here. And apology for that. Yep, you obtain this information, and sometimes it could be positive here, sometimes it could be, for example, here there's a negative, etc. You put into the formula, and it will show you the outcome. If it's negatively correlated, then the slope is more steeper, but not necessarily. And so we do have a study, our recent study in PSYCH that was published literally June 1st, this month. We have an online supplement that actually the reviewer actually asked this specific question, and we did a mini study to answer the reviewer's question. And then the outcome is that if it's negatively or positively correlated, Pareto optimization still contributes to the outcome, to the solution, compared to when you are not considering the objectives at all, simply because even if you are positively correlated, it's not likely that it's 1.0 positively correlated, then that would have a construct mixology issue. So if there is slightly difference, then multi-objective optimization could strike a balance between them two. Of course, when you're more negatively correlated, because the slope is more steep, there's more trade-off, there's more gain of using multi-objective optimization. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, if it didn't, please write back in the Q&A and we'll revisit it.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so I've talked about so far hiring scenarios, and I promise to go into more broader organizational applications. So what does this mean? What does these three contributions of multi-objective optimization mean for the broader organizational sciences? Well, using multi-objective optimization, we could optimize multiple organizational objectives such as productivity, cost, etc., work life. Understand the relationship among different organizational objectives, and study how different variables influence multiple objectives simultaneously. For example, again, here is the Pareto optimal curve here. Instead of performance, diversity, retention, etc., we could say, look at performance and occupational health. So this is kind of related to the more recent concept about sustainable performance, where we want to make sure that the employees are productive, performing well, etc. But on the long run, unfortunately, like during COVID, many of us have experienced where we perform, try to juggle everything, but eventually build burnout. So the question is that how can we make sure that the employees are feeling like they're doing their best, they're fulfilling their roles, etc., and also maintain a high level of subjective well-being among the employees, both physical and mental well-being. And what influences that? Some of them, a lot of the studies might be about job demands, job resources, the job characteristics. Some of the studies could also look at, say, individual characteristics. Some people are more suitable in this environment versus the other. Other questions such as performance and retention, work and life, and productivity and cost, we could all study it using a multi-objective optimization approach. Just basically getting the data and putting it all, mapping them all together and see what factors influence the balance between these different objectives. All right, so that is the concept of all multi-objective optimization. Hopefully by now you kind of know how it could be applied and what does it do. Now, the next couple of minutes, I will do a demonstration and a live demonstration too. And then usually the hope for live demonstration is that it actually works, that the other things do not crash. Okay, so this is again a quite statistical method. So we really tried, my collaborators and I really tried hard for many years to make it very accessible to the broader organizational science field, because we really think that this method is very relevant and very important. So in that regard, we have developed point and click web applications as well as R packages. These are open source and free for use. For example, this one, we call it Pareto R, the capital R. They are developed based on R, the R language, so it's a capital R. This one we published in JPN 2017, and it has been used in multiple papers and conferences across the board, with my collaborators as well as other teams. And this one has Shiny App. Shiny App is a point and click application, as well as the back-end running thing is an R package. So if you like more visual, want to kind of put the data in and one click and it does the job, then point and click Shiny App is more of your thing. But if you want to kind of do it more flexibly, if you're more R wizard, if you just want to kind of play it around, then our package is more of your thing. Both of them do the same thing because one runs on the other. Okay, so this is to optimize two objectives, for example, performance and retention. Here, can you see?
Yeah, we can see.
Yeah, so this link here takes you to this web page. I jumped a little bit. So this one, I'm talking about the Pareto R is this one, Pareto one. So here you'll input some necessary information here. For example, here you have the predictor correlations. You might say you might have 4 predictors. In this example, P1, P2, P3, P4, etc. You input the empirical data that you collected in your organization, etc. And then you hit this button at the bottom that says get Pareto optimal solution. And after a couple of seconds, and please be patient because it's kind of complex in the background, so it needs a couple of seconds to run. But afterwards, it'll provide you with the plots as well as each of the solutions. Let's go into them one by one. These plots, you should be familiar by now. These are similar kind of plots that I showed in earlier slides, where on the left-hand side, this is a Pareto curve. On the right-hand side are the predictor rates. Right, so sort of this blue predictor rate looks like the conscientiousness curve that Tim pointed out, for example. So you could definitely use these two curves to get a gist of what's going on between these two objectives, as well as how the predictors are influencing the balance between these two objectives. Now, more detail down here, it will provide you the data, so the solution. So for example, this solution here corresponds to this point, and the Pareto optimal curve to the bottom right. And then this solution is where P1, P2, P3, P4, these are different predictors, are rated 0, 0, 1, and 0. You'll see here that seems like only P3 is rated. And this solution gives you this much, what we call adverse impact ratio. That is a operationalization of diversity and the Harmony scenario, as well as performance outcome, etc. So this is how the Pareto optimal, the Pareto R works. Going back, we also created another tool to optimize 3 objectives. What if we are more interested in more objectives? So this one is more recently published in PSYCH. Still going through the proof editing, online first published on June 1st. This is part of the combined paper that's under the machine learning special issue and PSYCH. So anyways, so this is study 3. This one optimizes 3 objectives. Again, the Shiny app corresponding to this one is here. So similarly, you input the information and click get solution. This takes a little bit longer simply because you're optimizing 3 rather than 2. So it's more complex. But after a while, let's see. Okay, so because we're optimizing 3 objectives compared to 2 objectives where it was a 2D plot, now it's actually a 3D plot. Right, 3D plot that shows us these different solutions. And at the bottom, similarly, it provides you with the outcomes, the predicted rates, etc. And this one have way more simply because you have 3 objectives and it's more complex. Again, you can click here, etc., to input and sort information. Both of these tools have accompanying R package. So the 2 objective one, R package is uploaded to GitHub, which you have instructions to download it directly using R. And then the 3 objective one is uploaded on Grant. Right, so that is that. I hope you could use it to kind of play around to more facilitate these tools. We've also developed, we've also created extensive guides and manuals, etc., to help you kind of think through your own multi-objective methodology. So these are present in these 2 papers, both published in 2023 and 2017 in PSYCH and JP. And specifically on this more recent paper in PSYCH, we have created a checklist of the key decisions for adopting multi-objective optimization for personal selection, and also discussion of more broader organizational applications. I won't go into details here, but good thing is that this paper is open access. So by now, even whether or not you have the VPN to your university, you should be able to download it in one click. All right. More in a more broader level, this paper that we published in 2020 talks about the practical and legal and the more broader aspects of this methodologies to kind of further demystify, further align that with actual practice, and then actually help the organizations apply it to their organizational practice. This paper also lists a number of recent publications using multi-objective optimization up until 2020, because this paper was published in 2020, as well as papers that discuss this methodology for a more broader audience. Ever since that, there has been more studies that have been published in various organizational science journals that uses multi-objective optimization in various different applications. So I hope at the end of this talk, you will know kind of sort of have an idea of what multi-objective optimization is and that it is highly relevant to the organizational applications, and consider how you could use it in your organizational science research and or practice. All right, so that's it for my talk. Thank you all. Any questions?
So yeah, add them to the Q&A. I did have a question as I was listening, and super interesting. I'm wondering in my own work, if I wanted to collect data that would be, such that so that I could use this, what does the data set look like? Because it seems like you need, for each one of the points on the curve, you need multiple observations so that then you can assess the beta weights as it goes, but I'm a little confused.
No. So yeah, that's a great question. You don't need different observation samples for each of the curve. You only need one. You only need one, and that one data collection will include the predictors, variables, etc., as well as the objects. So, for example, Tim, can you give me an example of what kind of objective you might be interested in? Dependent variable you might be interested in.
I mean, job performance sounds great. We could just stick with something like that. Yeah.
Okay, job performance and?
Let's stick with just the one you had, diversity and job performance, and diversity and yeah, but
right.
The curve that you were showing.
Right. Diversity and job performance are two objectives. So the data you collect will include different, say, independent variables or predictors, say personality or interview scores, resume, etc. The correlation among these variables, as well as the correlation between these independent variable or predictors with the dependent variable or objective. So the correlation between these predictors or relation in general with, say, job performance and diversity. And in terms of diversity, it really depends on what kind of diversity you're talking about. Are you talking about demographic diversity? Is it race, gender, etc.? If so, then the relation between the predictor and then the, say, race, gender diversity might come in the form of group differences or other ways. But ultimately, it's one sample. As long as that sample have the correlation, the relation among the IVs or the predictors, as well as the correlation between the IV and DB or predictor and criterion. And it could help you generate different solutions, but just one sample.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we're pretty much out of time. So I would encourage, if you have further questions for Chelsea, feel free to reach out. I think it's okay for me to say that.
Yes.
And so, well, we had a question come in, but we'll probably bleed over. Should we, Hoda, do you think we should take the last question or push it for offline?
Yeah, we have 2 more minutes, so one more question. That's it.
Yeah. So the question was, how would I present this to a senior management team? What actions would I ask them to take? Would they change funding?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say, and in fact, there is actually a lot of consultation that's been going on every year. There's growing interest in the industry, industry company, etc. One thing is that compare it to their existing practice. For example, unit rating, right? So like they're not giving any predicted rates. Unit rating, okay, your existing practice results in these results in terms of, say, performance, retention, etc. Right? If I simply switch that to Pareto or multi-objective optimization, how could it change? And a lot of times, because multi-objective optimization like actively considers these different objectives, a lot of times you can obtain gains without losing others. So for example, you can obtain more performance at the same level of diversity gain, at the same vice versa, right? You can obtain more diversity at the same level of performance. Similarly, people stay longer, your statistics shows, at the same level of average performance. So that has been very persuasive. And a lot of the times, say if you don't change the predictor, if you don't change, say, your structured interview procedure, the way you collect data, and you're only changing how you combine these information, then it's actually very, very low cost. You simply need someone that knows that and then the tool are here, open access, right? So for the company, they don't need to say put a lot of hours in developing a brand new, say, interview procedure or a brand new assessment center. It's much more low cost with a lot of gain. So that have been very persuasive. And beyond that, while you're looking at, say, the different predictors, you can dive into deeper. But that would be my suggestion. And one more thing. The 2020 paper also talks about legal considerations, which organizations concern a lot. So I would suggest you to highly look into this paper because we dived into the common concerns and questions that organizations might have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think it was a great session. We had 21 questions that were answered that came through. So appreciate everything that Jeremy and Chelsea and Stina were able to talk through and answer. So we will be back next Wednesday as well. Chelsea, thank you so very much. Super, super interesting. I appreciate you answering all of my questions as we went through. So excellent. Hope everyone has a great day.